overall system of jiu-jitsu, but you have subsystems within it, each one integrated with the other, so that when one system fails, you can pass off to another and go back and forth until you get the win. That was my approach to jiu-jitsu. That's what I want to do. If I can innovate jiu-jitsu in any given direction, that's probably the one I would push the most.
Now, throughout this time, you're dealing with some pretty significant injuries and physical limitations that you've had. Tell me about those, what those were, and how those hindered you.
Yeah. When I was in my early teens, I was involved in a rugby injury where my knee was massively injured. Over the next 6 years, I would dislocate my knee. The ligaments appeared to be severely compromised. Every 6 months or so, I'd get a fresh injury, which would be severe, and I'd be on crutches. I spent a significant amount of my teenage years on crutches. Around the age of 19, I had one last injury, and my knee just seemed to have no power in it. Things like I walked with a limp, and you must remember this is in the 1980s in New Zealand, and this is pre-MRIs, pre-arthroscopic surgery. The doctors said, well, we can do an operation where we shorten the ligaments so that there's less looseness in there, and hopefully your knee will be strong again. An operation was performed, and unfortunately the ligaments were cut too short, and as a result my leg never straightened again. I developed a severe case of arthrofibrosis where my knee actually became deformed and doesn't straighten. Simple actions like walking, kneeling are extremely painful for me and have been my whole life.
Just walking around is painful?
Just walking is painful. Kneeling is extremely painful. And, it's not easy to do jiu-jitsu where there's a lot of kneeling. And also there were other kind of structural problems as I got older. Because I walk with a limp and one leg significantly bent and one straight, I tend to be completely out of balance, out of sync with my body. So I soon developed considerable hip and back pain. So this was something I carried with me my whole life. And when I started jiu-jitsu at the age of 28, there was a concern, am I going to be able to do this? Well, fortunately, ground grappling as a rule is generally easier on your body than standing martial arts. I don't think, for example, with my leg, I could even become moderately effective at Muay Thai or Taekwondo. It was something we have to be able to jump and land. I just couldn't do it. Whereas jiu-jitsu, because it's on the ground, you can become pretty good. So I battled through that, and I developed a satisfactory degree of competence. I got a black belt from Renzo Gracie, and I became one of his main teachers. So
how did you train with such a compromised knee?
You just figure out a way around it. You just, what are you going to do? Sit down and die?
But you never thought, well, boy, I fucked my knee up. I don't want to fuck my other knee up too.
I think at that point, you just got to go forward, and you got a choice. You're going to sit down and feel sorry for yourself, or you're going to do the best you can with what you've got.
And how limited was your game because of your knee? I mean, were you able to
standing position was difficult for me.
But were you able to do triangles and all sorts of different?
I mean, I had every week or so I would tweak it, and I'd be in pain for a day. I developed a strong need for ibuprofen throughout my life, and other problems started to emerge, especially the lower back. The lower back is a big issue, and gave me problems my whole adult life.
Does it still bother you now?
Less so now.
I have a machine I have to show you.
Okay.
It's called the reverse hyper. Have you ever heard of it?
Oh, yes. I believe they were used by a guy called Louis Simmons.
Yeah.
And, yes.
Yeah.
And
it's a life changer.
Yeah. I can't use one now because I have a hip replacement. And when you go up, it puts extreme shearing force on a hip replacement. So I can do it with body weight, but I can't do it with a weight. So I'm aware of what they are. I know many people speak very highly of them.
Yeah.
But I had this problem, and things didn't really become critical until my mid to early 40s, when, as a result of walking my whole life with a limp, my left hip started to become completely bone on bone. So then the problems doubled, because now I had a completely screwed up knee and a hip. But I couldn't get any kind of operations because George St. Pierre was fighting. Chris Weidman was fighting. They both had great goals, and so I delayed the hip operation as long as I could until George had his first retirement, and Chris Weidman became a world champion, and then moved further away to Long Island. Wasn't training with me so much. At that time, I started training the squad, and my first active competitive grappling student was Eddie Cummins, and I was able to work effectively with him as best I could with my hip problems, and of course the original leg problem. And then at some point it got to a point where I literally, if I walked down a New York City block, I would have to stop several times and just stand on the side of the road and wait for my hip to stop hurting so I could walk, and it just became impossible to work with, and I ended up getting a full hip replacement. And
so that's when they shear off the top of your hip, they screw a bolt down in there with a new hip.
That's correct.
And how does it feel now?
It's pain-free, which is a wonderful thing for me. Like any fake hip, it's never going to be as strong as your real hip. There's limitations on what I can do there. The only problem was that shortly after the hip replacement went in, then my knee finally collapsed after 30 years of problems, and so I'm going to have to get a knee replacement on the same leg. So yeah.
Whew. And how do they do that one?
Knee replacement's a little bit more tricky because you don't have as much bone mass to work with, and generally the longevity of knee replacements is not as because there's much more movement in the knee than there is in the hip. There's much greater range of motion. And there's less bone to affix to. They generally don't have the longevity of a hip replacement. So I'm 50 years old. So ideally you would want a replacement that outlived you, but I would probably have to get a second knee replacement when I get older to replace the first, which is not ideal, but I'm probably going to have to do it.
Well, who knows what kind of crazy technology they'll have down the line.
I hope so. I hope they give me some kind of superhero leg that turns things around for me.
Yeah, well, you never know. I mean, it's just the nature of the hip replacement is so brutally invasive. The shearing off the top of the hip, and then the rod that's inserted deep into the bone of the hip, and then all that jazz.
Yeah.
It's a lot. There's a lot going on there.
So to answer your question, in the early days it was an impediment that I worked around, but as I got older, I had to do a first operation, and now a second. Believe it or not, Joe, I was actually scheduled to get my knee replacement tomorrow, but I didn't do it because Gary Tonin is going to be fighting his first MMA fight in March 26th.
Now, is he fighting for 1FC?
1FC.
So
interesting. If I got the knee replacement now, I would not be able to help him get ready for his first MMA fight, which I thought would be that's not fair on my part,
Right.
And so I delayed it until after that fight.
Why did he decide on 1FC?
That's an interesting question. You'd have to ask Gary Tonin to be certain. But he, I think one of his main fears was that if he went through the amateur route and then worked his way towards the UFC, there would be problems because he's already an established name in grappling. And I think he was concerned that it would be difficult for him to get people to fight amateur and then eventually make his way to the UFC. Whereas 1FC is a fairly well-known organization, and they were pretty open. He did a grappling match for them, and they loved it. They were like, are you interested in MMA? And so he could, as it were, go into a fairly high level of MMA right from the start, as opposed to do a long, circuitous amateur route and then battle his way into the UFC. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe that was the logic behind it.
Now, are you able, so when you're demonstrating techniques, are you demonstrating them verbally? Or
after the hip replacement, I could only do it verbally, and I had to trust in my students, Eddie Cummins, Gary Tonin, Gordon Ryan, and others, Brian Glick, no one knows him, but he's one of my great students. I would point with a stick, and they would do the moves for me. Since then, I've gotten a little better, and I like to demonstrate as best I can. There's days when I I can barely walk, and on those days I'll have the students go through. Sometimes there's certain standing techniques that are a little risky for me to do, and I'll have students demonstrate those. But I do what I can on the days that I teach.
It is quite fascinating that a guy who has catastrophic injuries of his leg is one who is known for being an innovator and crushing people's legs.
There is something kind of strange about that.
Yeah, you were joking around
yeah.
about it being revenge.
Yeah, this is my revenge against the world. If